All right, welcome to our Introduction to Diffusion lecture. And again, this is one of those concepts that we're going to cover a lot this year. So as long as you walk away and you feel like you have kind of a basic idea of how it works, we're going to keep coming back to it and keep coming back to it so that by the end, when we talk about culture in March, you should have a pretty solid idea of how things spread out and how things diffuse across space. So when we talk about diffusion, we tend to talk about it in geography mostly in terms of culture. And so when we're talking about cultural diffusion, we're talking about the spatial spread of learned ideas, innovations, and attitudes. Okay? And one of the key pieces is that anytime we're ever talking about culture, it is always something learned. Culture is not inherent in a given area. It is always something that's learned and it's passed from generation to generation. Every element of culture originates in one or more places and then spreads outwards from there. So whether that's a specific way of speaking or specific tools that are used or specific foods or things like that, it's always going to start in one place and then spread outwards from there. Sometimes it will spread very, very far, and other times it's going to stay really close to the area of origin, and that largely just depends on what kinds of barriers it runs into. We're going to end by talking about barriers, so I'll come back to that idea. Just know that does matter. So when we're talking about expansion diffusion, which is for the most part what we're talking about when we're talking about culture, the most important idea is that the culture spreads throughout a population and from area to area. Okay? Within expansion diffusion, we've got hierarchical diffusion, which is to say ideas leaping from one node to another while temporarily bypassing those areas in the middle. And think of this kind of, if you understand what that root word hierarchy means, right? A hierarchy is when you've got basically a set order. Typically, these are going to be from higher order areas to lower order areas. So, might be from New York to LA, then maybe into Chicago or Dallas, Seattle, right? And then slowly spreading outwards from there. But the thing you notice in that case is that what we're doing is we're leaping, right? My example, New York, LA, Chicago, Seattle, Dallas, basically has to do with population sizes. And so we went from one end of the country to the other, and then we started to fill in some of the areas in the middle. Okay, contagious diffusion. Honestly, the best way for me to remember this is to think about it in terms of disease and contagious disease. And the way that contagious diffusion works is that it spreads outwards wave-like from a given node or from a given starting point. Involves typically person-to-person contact. These days, that person-to-person contact doesn't necessarily need to be like I'm facing you. It could be like over the internet. Okay? But it's still that one person to another contact. Of these three, stimulus diffusion is probably the hardest for kids to understand. And the example I like to use that seems to work really well for a lot of kids is the example of McDonald's in India. Okay, and with stimulus diffusion, we're accepting the general idea, but we're rejecting some specific trait related to that idea. So if we're talking about McDonald's in India, right, it's a little counterintuitive if you know anything at all about Hindu culture. Because in Hindu culture, cows are sacred, so they don't eat beef. Don't eat anything made from beef, anything like that. So it's counterintuitive that there would be a McDonald's in India until you stop and think about what McDonald's in India serves. McDonald's in India doesn't serve hamburgers, right? They serve veggie burgers because I would say the majority of Hindus are vegetarian. And even their fries, right, here in the States, the fries are actually cooked in beef fat. But over in India, they are not cooked in beef fat. Because even that little bit was highly upsetting. McDonald's actually almost got chased out of India on a rail when it was revealed that they were cooking their fries in beef fat over there. Okay, so again, that general idea of McDonald's or of fast food, right, gets accepted, but that specific trait, the hamburger, gets rejected. That's stimulus diffusion. Okay. Relocation diffusion is probably, honestly, the easiest one to get because it literally involves somebody picking up and moving, migrating, to a new location and carrying their new ideas, their new practices with them. And if your parents are immigrants or if you're an immigrant, you know this firsthand because you probably you potentially speak a different language at home. You certainly might eat different food, or your parents might have certain attitudes or ways of looking at things that feel like they're out of sync with the rest of the U.S. And that's those traits, any one of those traits coming with them, that's relocation diffusion. So what we've got here are just some graphics to help you understand cultural diffusion. And if it were me, I would probably pause it and sketch the graphics into my notes at this point. Partially because what it does is it'll help you visualize what's going on. And if you're not a visual person, if the graphics aren't going to help, then don't do that. But for most people, having some picture of those graphics in your notes is going to help you understand it. Right, so it's just a visual way of seeing those different types of diffusion. On our last slide here, what we're going to talk about is barriers to diffusion. Okay? And diffusion, again, is just this general idea of things spreading out. We're talking largely about culture, right? But diffusion is a concept that should be familiar probably from science already. Okay, so we're talking about barriers to diffusion, and we're talking about absorbing barriers, things that completely halt diffusion. Okay, so if this were science class, what I might talk about is when you put down a paper towel around the edge of a water spill, right, completely stops the water from continuing to move along the table. But when we're talking about culture, absorbing barriers tend to be things like mountains, okay, or even up until really relatively recently, when we're talking about historical time, oceans, okay, things that halt diffusion, that make it stop. These can be political, they could be economic, cultural, or technological. Okay, and political could be like borders. Okay. Economic could just be an inability to pay for a certain trait, right? Like something from pop culture, for instance. We already kind of talked a little bit about a cultural example when we talked about India, okay, and Hindus not eating cows. Technological could literally be not having access to the technology that you would need. But it's very rare, especially these days, that that things run into absorbing barriers. What's much more common, significantly more common, are barriers that are permeable. Okay? And permeable just means that the diffusion, the trait can move through it. Might slow it down. Okay, it might weaken the strength, but the trait is going to continue to diffuse. Okay, it will again weaken the spread. It might retard in that classic sense of to slow down, okay, or to help prevent the continued spread. So that's our and permeable barriers. Somebody was asking earlier today for examples. These days are things like oceans. We could talk about the U.S.-Mexican border, for instance, being a permeable barrier. As much as some people would like to try and make it an absorbing barrier, it's a permeable barrier, right? Things are slowed down moving across it, but they still move across it. The Canadian border, right, is a permeable barrier. So that's our lecture, our Introduction to Diffusion lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to come and see me, ask them, get them all answered, and get ready for your test later this week.